Welcome to another installment of Ask John. We're joined today with John Kaminski, the director of the Center for the Study of the American Constitution. John, we have some questions that pertain to two questions in Unit 2 for the national competition. Question number 1 has some interesting thoughts about the need for amendments. And I'd like to pose this question to you. Why were amendments not considered much in the first 5 state conventions?
That's an interesting development that takes place. The Constitutional Convention sets the rules for ratification, and the Constitution is going to go to the state ratifying conventions. 9 state conventions are necessary to obtain ratification, and Congress, the Confederation Congress, does not need to approve the Constitution for it to go into effect. Those are the rules set up by the convention, and they violate the Articles of Confederation, Article 13, and everybody knows this, and yet pretty much everybody accepts these rules, even the anti-federalists, those people who will come to oppose the Constitution. Initially, there was not much opposition to the Constitution when it first came out. In fact, Gouverneur Morris, one of the delegates representing Pennsylvania in the convention, said we ought to go quickly because opposition will mount as time goes on, and he was absolutely correct. The opposition does increase, so that by December of 1787, only 3.5 months after the convention publishes the Constitution, you have a majority of Americans who probably oppose the Constitution if it's not amended. And so you have the Constitution going out to the states to be considered in conventions. The strange thing is that the Federalists come up with 2 new rules that are not official by any means. The Constitutional Convention didn't propose these. The Confederation Congress didn't propose these. But Federalists use these, and they get the Anti-Federalists to abide by these rules. The 2 rules are this. First, you must adopt the Constitution completely or reject it. No partial adoption. And second of all, no amendments. So that's a really strange thing, because everyone accepts the fact that the Constitutional Convention proposed a draft Constitution, that it was a draft. It was merely a proposal. Wouldn't you think you could amend it? Well, the Federalists are saying, no, you can't amend it. And so, and you must either accept the Constitution in toto or not. And so when the first conventions met, the first 5, and they meet fairly quickly, Pennsylvania is the first convention to come together, there is discussion of amendments in Pennsylvania in particular, and the Federalists say, no, we can't consider these. Benjamin Rush, one of the delegates to the Pennsylvania Convention, a Federalist, suggests on the 12th of December, they're nearing the end, well, if you've got amendments, why don't you bring them in? Well, James Wilson, the leader of the Federalists, didn't like that at all, but that was the opening door, and the Anti-Federalists did bring in some amendments, a whole list of amendments. But the Anti-Federalists couldn't get those amendments onto the journal, and so they published it in the newspapers and in a broadside as the dissent of the Pennsylvania minority, listing these amendments. The other 4 states that met quickly, that would include Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. There was, as we find in some letters, some desire for amendments, but that was never surfaced in those conventions because they adopted that rule that the Federalists put forth, no amendments. And so we don't have any consideration of amendments in those subsequent 4 state conventions. Then comes Massachusetts. Well, Massachusetts is a fairly large state in the sense that it has almost, 350 towns spread out over quite a distance, and in some island towns as well. because of economic problems, the towns were not always completely represented in the state House of Representatives. The state convention, however, was going to be paid for by the state government, and therefore all of the towns were represented. So you get delegates coming to the Massachusetts convention from all the towns, and no one really knows how they're going to vote. These people, a lot of them are anomalous. They haven't been active statewide in politics. And so no one's quite sure whether these delegates will favor the Constitution or not. Well, it takes about 3 weeks of debate in the Massachusetts Convention before Federalists realize they've lost. And if a vote comes up, the Anti-Federalists will win and the Constitution will not be adopted. And so these adept politicians, and the Federalists were just that, they were fantastic politicians. They realized they had to change their tactics. And so what they did was they approached John Hancock, the governor, who was elected president of the Massachusetts Convention. He was a very vain man. He wanted to be on the right side. He was sort of a fence sitter. And he wanted to stay aloof before the decision was actually made. And then he'd come out on the winning side. So the way the excuse he gave for staying out of the convention, even though he was elected president of the convention, was he had an attack of the gout, which is a very, very painful situation to be in. So he had to stay home in his house in Boston. The convention was meeting in Boston. And so after 3 weeks of debate, a committee of Federalists came to Hancock. They were his political opponents. And they said, John, we've got a deal for you. If you propose, and they have 9 amendments, if you propose these amendments as yours, and they are to be considered as recommendatory amendments, that is, ratification will not be conditional upon these amendments being adopted, but they will just be recommended to the first federal Congress that these be considered. If you do that, we'll support you as governor in the spring elections. It's an annual election. And they said also, we would support you as vice president of the United States. And then they sweetened the pot a little bit more by saying, you know, John, there's no guarantee that Virginia will ratify the Constitution. And if Virginia doesn't ratify the Constitution, George Washington will not be eligible to be president. What do you think, John? The next day, Hancock was carried into the convention on a litter, and he held up a piece of paper saying, do I have a plan for you? And it was these 9 recommendatory amendments. Well, that changed everything. That became the standard way of adopting the Constitution. There are 7 more state conventions that meet after that. In 6 of them, they propose recommendatory amendments. And so they follow this pattern. Without that pattern, it's highly doubtful that the Constitution would have been adopted without amendments or even recommendatory amendments. They needed that pattern. And that was, in fact, adopted. And you do get recommendatory amendments that are brought forth. And the future representatives, U.S. representatives, and the future U.S. senators are instructed propose these amendments in the first federal Congress, as opposed to going to a second constitutional convention, which might be dangerous in the eyes of Federalists.
I'd like to ask about structural amendments versus rights amendments, because some states actually made the distinction between amendments. So what is the difference?
When Massachusetts proposed its amendments, there were 9 of them. They were just a list of 9 amendments. This is also true of South Carolina and New Hampshire. It's also true of Maryland. The Maryland Convention doesn't actually adopt the amendments. They propose amendments, but they fail to get approved by the convention. It's not until Virginia comes along that they actually divide the amendments into 2 categories. The first category falls under Declaration of Rights, and the second category they call amendments to the Constitution, which they mean structural amendments. Now, throughout the debate over the Constitution, both kinds of amendments were being considered. Certainly should be a Bill of Rights, and all those rights that we know should be in a Bill of Rights. So freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, the right to petition, no excessive bails, no cruel, unusual punishments. These are all rights-type amendments that the Anti-Federalists are arguing for, and that get listed in the Declaration of Rights in the Virginia list of amendments, also the New York list of amendments, the North Carolina list of amendments as well. But then you have there were 20 of those amendments in Virginia. Then you have the structural amendments, and in Virginia there are 20 structural amendments, and they call for changes in the Constitution. All of the conventions that proposed amendments, and in Pennsylvania and in Maryland, where the amendments are not adopted by the conventions, but they're mentioned, in all of those conventions, and that means 8 of them all total, there is an amendment proposed to restore Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation, which in essence say that Article 2 says that Congress has only those powers that are expressly delegated to it by the Articles. All other powers are reserved to the states. And so they propose that amendment. Sometimes the word expressly is put in, expressly delegated powers. Congress only has authority in those areas. Sometimes that word expressly is not used. But the 10th Amendment to the Constitution sort of becomes the final result of that proposal, in which it says that the Congress has only those powers that are delegated to it. Leaves off the word expressly. All other powers are reserved to the states or to the people. And so that amendment is sort of the 10th Amendment is sort of the catch-all for these 8 other proposals to reinstate Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation. But other type of structural amendments would be getting rid of the vice president. No need for a vice president. The Senate should elect its presiding officer. Get rid of the lack of separation of powers in regards to the Senate, so that there would be a privy council that would advise the president on appointments and on the ratification of treaties. The Senate also would not have judicial power. That is, impeachments would be tried by some other body. They didn't say what that other body would be, but it wouldn't be by the Senate. So these are structural amendments. Another very important and widespread amendment was on taxation. That under the Constitution, the central government, the Congress, has the power to levy and collect taxes. And there's all kinds of taxes, including direct taxes, which would be land taxes and other direct taxes. That's a dangerous thing. And so in all of the recommendations for amendments, you have, before direct taxes are levied, there would be a requisition. This is like under the Articles of Confederation. Congress asks the states for money. The states were obliged to pay. Well, they didn't pay always under the Articles. And so what these amendments proposed was, before Congress would levy a tax, a direct tax, Congress would ask the states to come up with a certain amount of money. And the states then could decide how they would raise that revenue. And if the states didn't raise the revenue within a certain period of time, then Congress could step in and levy the tax and collect it any way that it chose fit to collect it, and there'd be a fine assessed also. That's another structural amendment. One of the provisions of the Constitution that was really denounced by almost everybody, even many Federalists were critical of Article 1, Section 4, which gave Congress the power to regulate federal elections. The argument for this was, what happens if a state is invaded, as Georgia and South Carolina were during the Revolution, and what happens if a state doesn't send representatives to Congress or doesn't elect senators, such as Rhode Island not sending delegates to the Constitutional Convention. This could kill the government, and therefore Congress should step in. Well, the Anti-Federalists were saying, that's legitimate, but why don't you say this? Why are you so general in Article 1, Section 4, giving Congress virtually complete power over regulating federal elections. And so the amendment would limit it to when states were unable to hold elections, either through invasion or because they were recalcitrant and not electing the delegates that they should be electing to Congress. So these are the types of amendments, structural amendments, that were included in the proposals. Madison was very fearful of those structural amendments because, and many other Federalists were too, that this would change the nature of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights type amendments were not so dangerous to Federalists. In fact, they thought they maybe were not necessary. But the structural amendments could change the very nature of that federal-state relationship.
So some anti-federalists, when they looked at these two different kinds of amendments, they came up with this phrase, and a few use this milk and water amendments. Which of the two kinds of amendments were they referring to when they used that phrase?
Well, that's a phrase that doesn't get brought forth until Madison makes his proposal for amendments in the first Federal Congress. In a wonderful speech on June 8th, 1789. It's a fantastic speech. Who better to give a speech in favor of amendments, a Bill of Rights, than one of the arch opponents of the Bill of Rights during the ratification debate? Well, Madison saw that his election to Congress was predicated on his support of a Bill of Rights, so he does change his outward appearance. In fact, he writes a couple letters to friends in Virginia asking them to publish these letters, which is an unusual thing, saying that I've always favored amendments to the Constitution, and particularly a Bill of Rights. That's not true, but that's what he said. And so when Madison goes to the Virginia Convention in June of 1788, he says, if we get ratification, trust us, we will support amendments. And the amendments are proposed then 2 days later on the 27th of June, 1788. And now, a year later, when he's in Congress, he fulfills his promise. He brings forth the argument in favor of a Bill of Rights. And that's what he's advocating, not the structural changes. And he says this quite clearly. He follows through in his promise in June of '88 to the convention, I'll support a Bill of Rights. He doesn't follow through with the promise, I'll support structural amendments. And so only the Bill of Rights is what he's proposing in June of 1789. Now, the Federalists in Congress don't like this because there are many other pressing concerns. Every single day that Congress does not pass an impost bill, the importing states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, they're making money that would normally go to the federal government. And the other states are saying, let's get on with this. Let's get this government going. Let's get a judiciary functioning. These are important concerns rather than amendments to the Constitution, a Bill of Rights. And one of the big concerns is not that the Bill of Rights is unknown to Americans, but the question is, how is it going to impact on the Constitution? And will it take a long time to debate? And so that's why Federalists are opposed to Madison's amendments, but still he presses forward for the amendments. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, and there are very few of them in Congress, Elbridge Gerry in the House of Representatives, Richard Henry Lee and William Grayson, the only two Anti-Federalist senators, they object to Madison's amendments because they realize that this is, to quote them, a tub to the whale. This is a metaphor from Jonathan Swift, showing that when the whalers go out in their whale boat, the small boat, ready to harpoon the whale is bearing down on them, and they're in grave danger. They throw a tub over, hoping that the whale will go after the tub. So this is a metaphor for a diversion. And so what the Anti-Federalists are saying is Madison is throwing out a diversion, these Bill of Rights type amendments, to take away attention from the structural amendments, the real important amendments that will change the nature of the government. And so you have various terms, milk and water amendments, fluff and syllabub and fluff, showing that the Bill of Rights type amendments are not that important in the grand scheme of things, especially from the Federalist point of view, who said that they are indeed already protected. But the Anti-Federalists are afraid that the structural amendments will now no longer be on the minds of the people throughout the country. And they're absolutely correct. Once Madison proposes those amendments and they get through Congress, which is a difficult process to happen, Madison needed Washington's help to get that through Congress, 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. And once they get out, the opposition to the Constitution sort of fades away. And the Constitution, which had been such a critical issue dividing the country, now becomes almost a sacred document because these rights are indeed protected. And the demand for these structural amendments fades away. So that's why the Anti-Federalists were somewhat fearful about those Bill of Rights type amendments.
But I have to ask, why wasn't the 10th Amendment enough to satisfy some of these Anti-Federalists? Did it boil down to the word expressly, or was there something else?
To a great extent, it was that word expressly. And in fact, the word expressly was suggested to go in that amendment. It was an amendment to the draft, what will become the 10th Amendment, and it was rejected. And so John Marshall, in his famous case, McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, when he's talking about implied powers, saying that there are implied powers, and he refers back to the debate in Congress, saying that they did consider the word expressly, and they took that word out. And so Madison's argument is the 10th Amendment is virtually meaningless. That is, if you interpret the Constitution correctly, in the first place, it will say exactly what the 10th Amendment says. Now, Madison follows up on this later on in the 1790s, and then he follows up in the bank over the bank bill. That is, he follows it up in the debate in the 1820s on internal improvements. He says there are three ways to interpret the Constitution. One is a strict interpretation. And he says, nobody wants that. That was the Articles of Confederation. And we have to have some leeway. And the proper way to interpret the Constitution, he says, is to give it a natural or liberal interpretation. The danger is, and these are his words, a forced construction. And he was saying Hamilton had a forced construction over the bank bill. And the advocates for internal improvements from the federal government, a forced construction. Madison was in favor of internal improvements, roads, canals, and even railroads. Amazing, under Madison, he's favoring railroads in the 1820s. But it should be done under the auspices of a constitutional amendment that would allow Congress to fund these measures. Without that, this was unconstitutional because it was, in Madison's estimation, a forced construction. So according to Madison, the 10th Amendment didn't mean anything. And according to many Anti-Federalists, it didn't mean very much because that word expressly was not in there. This list of amendments was important to these folks back then, 200 and some years ago, so that a printer in Richmond, Virginia, his name is Augustine Davis, who was the printer of the Virginia Independent Chronicle. He was also the postmaster of Richmond. He compiled and published a pamphlet listing all the amendments that were proposed in the ratifying conventions. Not up until that time, 1789, so Rhode Island's amendments were not considered. But all the other amendments, even the proposed amendments that failed in Pennsylvania and Maryland, were listed in this pamphlet. And so it's sort of a handy-dandy pocket edition of all the amendments. And in fact, it's what Madison probably used in coming up with his proposal for amendments to the Constitution. And I might say one thing that we didn't discuss, all the amendments except for New York's amendments allude to the protection that was first enunciated back in Magna Carta, that no one could be deprived of their life, their property, or their freedom without due process, without a trial by jury of their peers under the law of the land. Critical, law of the land. New York, in its proposed amendments, changes that to the wording due process of law, which is much broader than law of the land. Madison uses that New York amendment, the recommendatory amendment, in creating what becomes the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. He jettisons his own state's law of the land amendment in favor of the New York due process of law amendment. So looking at that pamphlet by Augustine Davis, you would see all the amendments that were proposed.
Well, thank you, John. And I'd like to suggest for your consideration that we have on our website those recommendatory amendments from those states, Massachusetts and on, if you wanted to pursue that and look at the primary sources for your own study. Thank you for joining us.